The rain hammered against the cobblestones of Rome. September 1943. A tall figure in black emerged from the shadows near the Palazzo Doria, heart pounding, eyes scanning the street. German soldiers were everywhere. Their boots echoed off ancient walls. Their rifles gleamed under dim streetlights. And they were hunting him. The man ducked into an alley, pressing his back against cold stone. He was no soldier. He carried no weapon. He was a 6'2" Irish priest named Hugh O'Flaherty, and in his coat pocket was enough money to send him straight to a Gestapo torture chamber. Around the corner he could hear German voices barking orders. SS troops were surrounding the palazzo. They knew he was inside. They knew what he was doing, and now they were going to catch him. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a game of cat and mouse so audacious, so brazen, that even the Nazis could not believe it. Over the next 9 months, this one priest, armed with nothing but courage and an arsenal of ridiculous disguises, would save more than 6,500 lives. He would outwit the most feared intelligence agency on earth. He would turn the Vatican itself into a fortress of resistance. And he would do it all while standing on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, in plain sight of the men who had sworn to kill him. This is the story of the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, the priest who dressed as a nun, the man who made fools of the Gestapo, and the extraordinary act of forgiveness that would unite him with his mortal enemy in a way no one could have predicted. Before we dive deeper into one of the greatest rescue operations of World War II, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Stories like these deserve to be told, and we have so much more to uncover together. Hugh O'Flaherty was born on the 28th of February, 1898, in the small village of Lisrobin, County Cork, Ireland. His father, James, worked as a steward at the local golf course in Killarney, where the family soon moved. Young Hugh grew up surrounded by the rolling green hills of Kerry, and he developed 2 passions that would stay with him for life. The first was golf. By his late teens, he was playing off scratch, good enough to have turned professional. The second was faith. Something in the boy was drawn to the priesthood, to service, to the idea that one person could make a difference in a world that seemed determined to grind down the weak. In 1918, at the age of 20, O'Flaherty enrolled at Mungret College, a Jesuit institution in County Limerick. He was older than most of the other students, but he threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he brought to everything. The Irish War of Independence was raging outside the college walls. Violence was becoming commonplace. The young seminarian was learning about a world where brutality and faith existed side by side. In 1922, he was sent to Rome to complete his training, and on the 20th of December, 1925, Hugh O'Flaherty was ordained as a priest. He never returned to Ireland, not for decades. Instead, he entered the service of the Holy See and became a Vatican diplomat. Egypt, Haiti, Santo Domingo, Czechoslovakia. He moved through the world, learning languages, making connections, developing the kind of charm and quick thinking that would later save thousands of lives. In 1934, he was appointed a papal chamberlain and given the title of Monsignor. He was rising through the ranks of the Vatican bureaucracy, a talented administrator with a gift for solving problems. But the world around him was changing. A darkness was spreading across Europe. Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany. Benito Mussolini was transforming Italy into a fascist state, and in the corridors of power, men were making calculations about survival, about allegiance, about how far they were willing to go to preserve their positions. O'Flaherty watched it all. He listened, he learned, and when the time came, he made his choice. The Second World War erupted in September 1939. Italy initially stayed out of the conflict, but Mussolini could not resist the lure of Hitler's victories. In June 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and France. Suddenly, thousands of Allied soldiers found themselves imprisoned in Italian prisoner of war camps. O'Flaherty's first taste of what was to come arrived through his work with the Vatican. As a senior official, he was permitted to visit POW camps throughout Italy. His official mission was simple: find prisoners who had been reported missing in action, locate them if they were alive, send word to their families through Vatican radio. It was humanitarian work, sanctioned by all sides. But O'Flaherty saw more than just names and numbers during those visits. He saw young men, frightened and far from home, clinging to hope. He saw the conditions they endured. He saw the fear in their eyes when they talked about what might happen if the Germans took over, and he remembered their faces. He learned their stories. He made connections that would prove crucial in the months ahead. For 3 years, O'Flaherty visited camps, documented prisoners, and broadcast messages of hope through the airwaves. The war ground on. The Allies invaded North Africa, then Sicily. And in July 1943, everything changed. King Victor Emmanuel III, seeing which way the wind was blowing, removed Mussolini from power. The fascist government collapsed. Italy began secret negotiations to surrender. The news sent shockwaves through the Italian military. Guards at prisoner-of-war camps received conflicting orders. Some simply walked away. Others deliberately left gates unlocked. Thousands of Allied soldiers, sensing opportunity, escaped into the Italian countryside. They had no maps, no food, no weapons, and nowhere to go. But many of them remembered one thing. They remembered the tall Irish priest who had visited their camps. They remembered his kindness, his humor, his genuine concern for their welfare. And they knew where he worked. They knew he was in Rome. They knew the Vatican was neutral ground. Within weeks, escaped prisoners began appearing at the edges of Vatican City, exhausted, starving, desperate. Some spoke no Italian, some were wounded. All of them were hunted. Because while Italy had surrendered, Germany had not. Hitler's forces swept into Rome on the 10th of September, 1943. The Eternal City was now under Nazi occupation, and any Allied soldier caught outside a camp faced immediate execution or deportation to forced labor. The German commander responsible for maintaining order in Rome was a man named Herbert Kappler. He was an SS Obersturmbannführer, which translated to lieutenant colonel, and he served as the head of both the Gestapo and the SD, the Nazi security service, in the Italian capital. Kappler was not a simple thug. He was an intelligent, methodical man who had risen through the ranks of the Nazi intelligence apparatus through a combination of ruthlessness and efficiency. He had cold blue eyes, a thin face, and a reputation for getting results. Kappler's job was to break the Italian resistance, round up Jews for deportation, and eliminate any threats to German control. He had at his disposal a network of informers, a torture chamber at the notorious Via Tasso headquarters, and the absolute backing of Berlin. He answered to no one except Heinrich Himmler himself, and he had been given free rein to do whatever was necessary to maintain order. The two men could not have been more different. O'Flaherty was warm, gregarious, quick with a joke and a smile. Kappler was cold, calculating, a man who viewed human beings as problems to be solved. O'Flaherty believed in the inherent dignity of every person. Kappler believed in the supremacy of the state and the necessity of terror. They were about to become the central figures in one of the most remarkable confrontations of the war. The first escaped prisoners arrived at O'Flaherty's door in September 1943. The priest did not hesitate. He did not wait for permission from his superiors. He did not consult with Vatican bureaucrats about protocols or procedures. He simply opened his door and said yes. Those first few rescues were chaotic. O'Flaherty was making it up as he went along. He smuggled 3 British soldiers past the Swiss guards and hid them in a flat inside Vatican territory. He bought them civilian clothes. He somehow obtained forged identity papers. It was amateur hour, improvised, and dangerous, but it worked. 3 soldiers became 10, 10 became 20. Word spread through the underground network of escaped prisoners that there was a tall Irish priest at the Vatican who could help. They came from all directions: British infantry, American pilots, South African gunners, Greek soldiers, even Soviet prisoners who had escaped from German camps. They all found their way to the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, where O'Flaherty stood each evening, saying his prayers and watching for desperate faces. The operation grew faster than anyone expected. O'Flaherty quickly realized he could not do this alone. He needed help, money, safe houses, forged documents, a network of trusted collaborators who could move people, hide them, feed them, and keep them alive until the Allies arrived. He began recruiting. The team that came together was one of the most unlikely resistance cells in history. There were other priests, including 2 young New Zealanders named Owen Snedden and John Flanagan. There were Maltese Augustinian fathers. There was a Swiss count. There were 2 agents working for Free French Intelligence. There was the wife of the Irish ambassador, a woman named Delia Murphy, who was famous in Ireland as a singer of traditional ballads. And there were Italian civilians, Roman citizens, who risked everything to hide strangers in their homes. One of the most remarkable of these was a Roman woman who lived in a small apartment with 6 children. When O'Flaherty asked if she could hide 2 refugees, she looked at him and said, "No, send me 4." By the end of the month, she had so many men hidden in her tiny flat that they were sleeping in the bathtub and on the kitchen floor. The organization became known as the Rome Escape Line. O'Flaherty was its driving force, but the man who brought military discipline to the chaos was Major Sam Derry, a British officer who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp by organizing 5 simultaneous tunnel breaks, then leaped from a speeding train carrying him to Germany. Derry made his way to Rome, disguised as a clerk, and smuggled himself into the Vatican. There, he became O'Flaherty's second-in-command, handling logistics, security, and the day-to-day management of an operation that was growing larger by the week. Together, they established a network of safe houses throughout Rome: apartments, farmhouses, convents, monasteries, college dormitories. One of the first hideouts, in a move of breathtaking audacity, was located directly beside the local SS headquarters. The Nazis had no idea that just feet away from their offices, escaped Allied soldiers were eating dinner and planning their next moves. O'Flaherty coordinated everything from his room at the Collegio Teutonico, the German college inside Vatican City. He kept meticulous records in a small ledger, tracking every person his organization sheltered. He maintained contact with Sir Darcy Osborne, the British ambassador to the Holy See, whose butler, John May, proved to be, in O'Flaherty's words, a genius and the most magnificent scrounger in Rome. Money flowed through the network, supplied by the British government, sympathetic aristocrats, and donations from the church itself. But the most visible symbol of O'Flaherty's defiance was his nightly vigil on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Every evening, as the sun set over Rome, the tall Irish priest would stand on the top step just inside Vatican territory, saying his prayers. He was waiting, watching, ready to help anyone who approached. And he was directly visible to the SS troops who patrolled the boundary line below. Kappler became aware of the rescue operation within weeks. His informers told him about the escaped prisoners. His agents tracked the movement of suspicious individuals through the city, and his intelligence pointed to one man as the mastermind behind it all, the Irish priest at the Vatican. But Kappler faced a problem. Vatican City was neutral territory. It was technically a separate country, governed by the Pope. German forces could not simply march in and arrest O'Flaherty without creating a massive international incident. Hitler himself had ordered that Vatican neutrality be respected, at least for now. The propaganda value of appearing to violate a sacred religious site was too dangerous, so Kappler tried other tactics. He had a white line painted on the pavement at the opening of St. Peter's Square. That line marked the border between Vatican City and occupied Rome. And Kappler sent a message to O'Flaherty. If the priest ever stepped over that line, he would be killed immediately. O'Flaherty received the message. He understood it perfectly, and he responded in a way that would define his entire wartime career. He walked to the top step of St. Peter's and stood there in plain sight, daring the Nazis to come and get him. If you're finding this story as incredible as we do, consider subscribing and sharing it with others. The courage of people like O'Flaherty reminds us what humanity is capable of. Now let us continue. Herbert Kappler was not a man accustomed to being mocked. He was the most feared man in Rome. He had the power to arrest, torture, and execute anyone who crossed him. And now, this Irish priest was standing on those steps every single evening, waving at the SS troops, practically inviting them to come and stop him. The game of cat and mouse that followed became legendary among both the resistance and the German occupation forces. Kappler threw everything he had at O'Flaherty. He planted informers in the Vatican. He had agents follow anyone who spoke to the priest. He set up elaborate traps designed to catch O'Flaherty outside the safety of Vatican territory, but O'Flaherty was always one step ahead. He seemed to know when danger was approaching. He had an uncanny ability to sense a trap, and when things got too hot, he simply vanished, only to reappear somewhere else, helping more refugees, moving more people to safety. The SS troops guarding the White Line grew increasingly frustrated. They would stand there with their submachine guns, knuckles white from gripping so hard, watching the priest on the steps above them. They were waiting for him to slip, waiting for a single toe to cross that line. But O'Flaherty never slipped. He knew exactly where the boundary was. He would stand there, saying his prayers, sometimes even waving cheerfully at the soldiers below. And there was nothing they could do. What the Nazis did not realize was that O'Flaherty was using himself as bait. While the entire Gestapo force was focused on watching him on the steps, his network was busy elsewhere. Refugees were being moved, documents were being forged, money was changing hands. The attention O'Flaherty drew to himself gave his operatives the cover they needed to work in the shadows. But O'Flaherty's activities could not be confined to the Vatican. The people he was trying to save were scattered throughout Rome. Safe houses needed to be visited. Money needed to be delivered. Contacts needed to be maintained. And that meant going outside. That meant crossing the White Line. That meant entering Kappler's territory. A lesser man might have stayed inside, safe behind the Vatican walls. But that was not O'Flaherty's way. He treated the whole thing like a sport. A deadly high-stakes sport where the penalty for losing was a bullet to the head or a one-way trip to a concentration camp, but a sport nonetheless. He started wearing disguises, and not subtle ones. These were theatrical costumes, the kind of thing you might see in a stage production. One day he needed to deliver money to a safe house across the Tiber River. The SS had checkpoints on every bridge. They were looking for a tall Irish priest. So O'Flaherty dressed as a street sweeper and pushed a cart right past the checkpoint. The guards never gave him a second glance. Another time he disguised himself as a postman and walked through neighborhoods crawling with German patrols. On other occasions he dressed as a laborer covered in dust and grime, the last person anyone would suspect of being a Vatican official. The trolley workers of Rome, men who had attended his early Sunday masses for years, smuggled him around the city on their vehicles. The friendship and gratitude of these ordinary workers proved invaluable. And then there was the nun disguise. Stories circulated through the resistance that O'Flaherty occasionally dressed in a nun's habit to move through the city. The image of this 6'2" Irish priest, with his broad shoulders and distinctive face, trying to pass as nun, was almost comical. But it worked. People saw what they expected to see. A nun was invisible. A nun was harmless. A nun could go anywhere. One of the most dramatic escapes occurred at the Palazzo Doria, the home of Prince Filippo Doria Pamphili, one of O'Flaherty's aristocratic supporters. The prince had been providing cash to fund the rescue operation, and O'Flaherty had come to collect a payment, but Kappler had the palazzo under surveillance. Just as O'Flaherty was preparing to leave, the prince's secretary happened to look out the window. The street had been blocked off. SS troops were surrounding the building, and Herbert Kappler himself was getting out of his car to supervise the search. Prince Filippo was resigned. This was it. They were caught. Time to give up. But O'Flaherty did not give up. If he could get himself and the money out of the palazzo, the Germans would have no proof. The prince would not be compromised. The operation could continue. As SS men thundered into the building, O'Flaherty dove into the cellars. He needed time to think. He noticed a strange rumbling noise coming from one corner. Coal was being poured down a chute that opened onto the courtyard above. Two coalmen were nervously watching the German soldiers. O'Flaherty found an empty coal sack. He pulled off his Monsignor's robes and hat, stuffed them into the sack, and covered his shirt and face with coal dust. Then he waited until one of the coalmen was directly above the chute. He whispered a warning and asked the man to hide in the chute while the priest took his place. A few minutes later, O'Flaherty was carrying his sack past two lines of SS soldiers. They moved out of his way so he would not get their uniforms dirty. Once the coal truck blocked him from view, he took off down the street. The coalmen finished their delivery and left, unmolested. Kappler spent 2 hours searching the palazzo from cellar to roof, but he left empty-handed. O'Flaherty ducked into the nearest church, washed up in the vestry, put his robes back on, and walked unchallenged back to the Vatican. It was, as one observer noted, the most gigantic game of hide-and-seek anyone had ever seen. There were other close calls. The Nazis came close to catching him multiple times. They set traps. They bribed informers. They even had a mole inside the Vatican itself, a former seminarian named Alexander Kurtna, who was secretly working for both the Soviets and, under duress, the Germans. Kurtna reported on O'Flaherty's activities, but somehow the priest always managed to stay one step ahead. Part of O'Flaherty's success came from his network of supporters. The people hiding refugees were not trained spies. They were ordinary Romans, shopkeepers, housewives, nuns, farmers. They took enormous risks, not because they were paid, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. Among the most dedicated were the Maltese Augustinian fathers Egidio Galea, Aurelio Borg, and Ugolino Gatt. There was Father Anselmus Musters, a Dutch Augustinian who had no love for the Nazi regime. There was Brother Robert Pace of the Brothers of Christian Schools, and there was Chetta Chevalier, a Maltese woman who hid refugees in her own home with her children and somehow escaped detection. Even Jewish religious services continued secretly in the Basilica of San Clemente, which was under the diplomatic protection of the Irish Foreign Office. On the Jewish Sabbath and on high holy days, beneath a painting of Tobias, Jewish refugees gathered to pray. It was an extraordinary act of interfaith solidarity in the midst of horror. The risks were very real. Italian fascist Pietro Koch, who ran a special task force charged with hunting partisans and rounding up deportees for the Gestapo, often boasted of his plans to personally torture and execute O'Flaherty if the priest was ever caught. Koch's unit, the infamous Banda Koch, was known for its brutality. They operated outside even the normal rules of German occupation, using methods so savage that even some SS officers were uncomfortable. But O'Flaherty was not intimidated. He seemed to have no fear, or if he did, he never showed it. One evening, a Jewish couple approached him on the steps of St. Peter's. They knew they were going to be deported. They had accepted their fate. All they asked was that O'Flaherty save their 7-year-old son. They offered him a long, solid gold chain as payment. O'Flaherty took the chain. He hid the boy safely. And then he obtained forged identity papers for the parents that allowed them to survive the occupation. At the end of the war, he reunited the family and returned the gold chain. He had kept it in a desk drawer in his room the entire time. When colleagues asked why he was being so careless with something so valuable, O'Flaherty shrugged, "Nobody here will steal it." Everything O'Flaherty did seemed to have a certain style. Once, a man he had hidden in Urban College developed appendicitis. O'Flaherty borrowed a car from a Vatican official and drove the man to Santo Spirito Hospital. There, the nuns quietly added the man to the surgery list. He was operated on by a German military surgeon. He recovered in a ward full of German officers. And then O'Flaherty drove him back to the college. The sheer audacity of these operations drove Kappler to fury. The Gestapo commander tried everything. He increased patrols. He offered rewards for information. He threatened anyone suspected of helping the escape line. But the network kept growing, and the priest kept winning. By late 1943, the Rome escape line was sheltering hundreds of people. The operation required constant attention. O'Flaherty and his team coordinated safe houses, organized food deliveries, obtained medical care for the sick and wounded, and maintained an elaborate system of forged documents. Money flowed through the network from the British government, which paid substantial sums to keep the operation running. The organization was remarkably diverse. The people O'Flaherty sheltered came from every corner of the Allied world. There were British soldiers, American airmen, South Africans, Greeks, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, even prisoners who had escaped from the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers who had somehow made their way to Rome. And there were Jews, hundreds of them, hiding in safe houses and convents and anywhere else that could be found. O'Flaherty did not discriminate. Anyone who needed help received it. He did not ask about religion or nationality or politics. He simply asked how he could help. That attitude attracted people from all walks of life to his cause. Communists worked alongside aristocrats. Catholics worked alongside atheists. Everyone understood that what they were doing transcended ordinary divisions. The German occupation authorities grew increasingly desperate. Rome was supposed to be a model of Nazi control. Instead, it was becoming a sieve through which Allied personnel and Jews were escaping by the hundreds. Kappler's reputation was on the line. Berlin was demanding results, and somehow this Irish priest was making a fool of the entire German security apparatus. Multiple plots were hatched to eliminate O'Flaherty. There were plans to kidnap him, plans to assassinate him, plans to lure him outside Vatican territory and arrest him on trumped-up charges. None of them succeeded. O'Flaherty seemed to have a sixth sense for danger. He would change his plans at the last minute. He would take unexpected routes. He would disappear and reappear somewhere else entirely. Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, the German ambassador to the Holy See, was secretly anti-Nazi. He violated direct orders from the German Foreign Office to warn O'Flaherty that the Gestapo had identified him as the leader of the escape network. It was von Weizsäcker who told the priest that he was a marked man. O'Flaherty thanked him and continued his work without missing a beat. The months dragged on through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944. The Allies were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. Everyone knew the liberation of Rome was only a matter of time. But for those in hiding, every day was an eternity. Every knock on the door could mean discovery. Every face on the street could be an informer. In March 1944, Italian partisans attacked a German police battalion marching through the Via Rasella in central Rome. They set off a bomb that eliminated 33 German soldiers. Kappler's response was immediate and brutal. He ordered a reprisal. For every German dead, 10 Italians would be executed. The Gestapo rounded up 335 prisoners, including Jews, political prisoners, and ordinary civilians. They were taken to the Ardeatine caves outside Rome and shot. The Ardeatine massacre shocked Rome. It was a reminder of what the occupation forces were capable of. It was a reminder of what would happen to anyone caught helping the escape line. And yet the network continued to operate. People continued to risk their lives. O'Flaherty continued to stand on the steps of St. Peter's. Spring turned to early summer. The Allied advance accelerated. On the 4th of June, 1944, American forces entered Rome. The German occupation was over. Herbert Kappler fled the city just ahead of the advancing troops. The reign of terror that had gripped Rome for 9 months was finally ending. When the Allies arrived, they found an astonishing situation. O'Flaherty and his network had kept nearly 4,000 escapees out of German hands. The final count was staggering. 6,425 people had been sheltered by the Rome escape line and were still alive at liberation. They included 1,695 British soldiers, 896 South Africans, 429 Soviets, 425 Greeks, 185 Americans, and men from 20 other nations. That number did not include the Jews and other civilians who had been protected by O'Flaherty personally. Of the approximately 9,700 Jews in Rome, only about 1,000 had been captured and deported to death camps. The rest had survived, many of them hidden by the church and its network of supporters. More than 5,000 Jews were sheltered directly by religious institutions, with another 3,700 hidden in private homes. The scale of the achievement was almost incomprehensible. In 9 months, with no military training, no weapons, and constantly under threat of death, O'Flaherty and his team had pulled off one of the largest rescue operations of the entire war. After the liberation, the accolades came pouring in. O'Flaherty was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to British forces in Italy. He received the American Medal of Freedom with silver palm. He was honored by Canada, Australia, and other Allied nations. The Italian government awarded him a lifetime pension, which he refused to use. In 1954, he was promoted to domestic prelate. He continued his work at the Vatican, serving as notary of the Holy Office and working closely with Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. He never sought publicity for his wartime exploits. He never wrote a memoir. He simply went back to his duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But there was one more chapter to this story, one that no one could have predicted, one that would define O'Flaherty's legacy in ways that went far beyond the war itself. Herbert Kappler was captured by the Allies and put on trial for war crimes. He was convicted for his role in the Ardeatine massacre and other atrocities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in an Italian military prison. The man who had terrorized Rome, who had ordered the execution of hundreds of innocent people, who had sworn to hunt down and destroy the Irish priest, was now locked in a cell. And then something extraordinary happened. Hugh O'Flaherty began to visit him, month after month, year after year. The priest who had been hunted by the Gestapo commander walked into that prison and sat with the man who had tried to eliminate him. They talked about the war, about faith, about forgiveness, about what it meant to be human in a world that had lost its humanity. Kappler's family had abandoned him. His former colleagues wanted nothing to do with him. The man who had wielded absolute power over millions of lives was now utterly alone. Except for the priest. O'Flaherty never lectured. He never demanded repentance. He simply showed up. He treated Kappler with the same dignity he had shown to every escaped soldier, every terrified refugee, every desperate soul who had come to him during the occupation. The visits continued for years, and slowly something changed in Herbert Kappler. The hardened Nazi intelligence officer, the architect of terror, the man who had sent hundreds to their deaths, began to question everything he had believed. He began to see the world differently. He began to understand what O'Flaherty had known all along, that every human being, no matter what they had done, was worthy of compassion. In 1959, Herbert Kappler asked to be baptized into the Catholic faith, and the man who performed the ceremony was Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. The hunter and the hunted, the torturer, and the resistor, united at last in an act of forgiveness that transcended everything that had come before. O'Flaherty suffered a serious stroke in 1960 and was forced to return to Ireland. He moved to Cahersiveen to live with his sister, the same quiet corner of Kerry where he had grown up all those years ago. On the 30th of October, 1963, Hugh O'Flaherty died. He was 65 years old. He was buried in the cemetery of the Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church in Cahersiveen. A monument was erected in Killarney town, and a grove of trees was dedicated to his memory in Killarney National Park. His story was later dramatized in the 1983 television film The Scarlet and the Black, with Gregory Peck playing O'Flaherty. But perhaps the truest measure of O'Flaherty's legacy was not in monuments or films. It was in the thousands of lives he saved, the soldiers who went home to their families, the Jews who survived to rebuild their communities, the children and grandchildren who exist today because one Irish priest refused to look away. He did not have a gun. He did not have an army. He had nothing but faith, courage, and an unshakable belief that every human life was worth saving. And with those tools, he defeated one of the most powerful and brutal regimes in history. When people asked him why he did it, why he risked everything, why he stood on those steps night after night, daring the Nazis to come and get him, O'Flaherty never gave grand speeches about heroism. He simply said it was the right thing to do. He saw people who needed help, and he helped them. It was as simple as that. The story of the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican is ultimately a story about choices. Herbert Kappler chose fear. He chose power. He chose to believe that some lives mattered more than others. And in the end, he found himself alone, abandoned, imprisoned, and searching for meaning. Hugh O'Flaherty chose love. He chose service. He chose to believe that every person, regardless of nationality or religion or circumstance, deserved to be treated with dignity. And in the end, he found himself surrounded by gratitude, honored by nations, and at peace with his conscience. The white line that Kappler painted on the pavement of St. Peter's Square was meant to be a barrier, a threat, a symbol of Nazi power. But O'Flaherty turned it into something else entirely. He turned it into a stage, a place where one man, armed with nothing but moral courage, could stand and show the world what true resistance looked like. He never fired a shot, he never raised a fist, but he fought a war that mattered, and he won. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one person can make a difference, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The courage of people like Hugh O'Flaherty should never be forgotten. These stories from history remind us what we are capable of in our darkest hours. Thank you for being here.